For the Woodn Company, this is Salvaged and Found, a woodworking and sustainability podcast where I sit down with industry leaders and owners making a difference. I'm Alec Balas, the CEO and founder of the Woodn Company. On this episode, I sit down with Roger Benton, the owner of RECO Brooklyn, a custom furniture company that reclaims fallen New York City trees from the waste stream and produces live edge slabs and custom furniture. We talk about how Roger got started with a huge fallen tree in Philly, the beauty of slab furniture, and how to create a sustainable future for harvesting trees. You can find his work at RECOBROOKLYN.com. We'll get to the conversation, but first, a word about our company.
It began on a late afternoon walk in the woods.
Just to start off, can you tell us your name and tell us about RECO Brooklyn? And
Yeah, well, my name is Roger Benton, and RECO Brooklyn is my baby. It's a company that we started with two friends, seems like ages ago, and we each had our own small, like 1 or 2 man furniture shop. And the three of us were friends, and we were collaborating on a line of furniture using only reclaimed materials. So I came up with the name RECO Brooklyn, meaning Reclaimed Collaborative, and we were all Brooklyn-based at the time. So the name came from there, and as things progressed, it went from reclaimed materials that come out of old buildings and things like that, to harvesting trees that come down, like storm-damaged trees. It's like the ultimate reclaimed material. And going from like the conveniently available reclaimed stuff to the stuff that you have to work for, like it's a log and you have to turn it into, usable stuff. It presented a lot of, big challenges and a huge learning curve that we knew nothing about. Eventually, it became something that I personally was 100% gung-ho about, and everybody else was like, this sounds like work. So, I decided to really give it my all, solo, and develop the idea behind what the company should be. Like, I was a furniture maker at heart first, and definitely wanted to keep making furniture. Like, I didn't want to just open a lumber yard. But, working with the reclaimed stuff really taught us about where wood comes from and how wood can be harvested either well and with good intentions, or not well and with profit only at mind. We started to become aware of wood that comes from all these places where, they'll spot trees from a helicopter and not ask permission, go in, take them down, and come out. And a lot of weird, shady things happen. And greed for certain species leads to over-harvesting of those species. Harvesting trees that came down in the city seemed like the most natural thing to do logically. Like, they're here already. A lot of them come down of their own accord or get taken down, whether it's a dangerous tree or if it's infected or if it becomes compromised in a storm and is then dangerous, or just to make way for real estate expansion. So there's a ton of material that's going to waste. And then, people buy material from sources that are harvesting it from wherever they can, from standing trees. So for me, sticking with the reclaimed theme really meant like going all the way and producing new fresh cut lumber from logs that would otherwise be waste, while reducing demand for standing forest trees to be cut into lumber, and also pulling a huge amount of volume out of the waste stream. And then the furniture aspect has always been there. Like, our specialty is finished furniture using this product, and we also sell that lumber to other makers so that they can know where their wood comes from. They can sell the story to their customers about using as eco-consciously harvested a wood product as you can get. And so the combined passion for making and woodworking and sourcing wood where I know exactly where it came from, and I can show you the picture of the tree that was broken in half in a storm, that's kind of the whole reason behind RECO Brooklyn right now.
And you guys are still using reclaimed wood currently, right? It's
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of reclaimed projects using the traditional reclaimed wood, which is like columns and beams and flooring and siding that's been taken from old buildings. And then we think of our material as reclaimed also because it's sort of similar. You know, it's taken from a waste revenue and turned into something, you know, it's beautiful and that is usable.
So why is that important to you? Like, what have you always felt that, like, importance for sustainability or like not wasting?
No, not really, until like we started to learn more and more about where wood comes from. So like for me, it started with tools. Like I was dorking out on really cool old tools, like 100, 200 years old that still are relevant and work really well, and that people used to use to make amazing furniture before electricity. And in that got me into woodworking, and then I started really getting into wood. Like certain tools are great, but also certain woods are great. Some woods are beautiful or very easy to work, or some woods are very hard to work, and some woods are, you know, ugly. So you start getting into wood, and then you start finding out like slowly where wood comes from. And if you stop to think about that, it becomes a bit of an ugly situation. You know, like there's deforestation domestically and abroad. There's certain species that just aren't available anymore. Like animals have been hunted to extinction, trees and certain species of trees have been harvested to near extinction or extinction. And it's because of a demand for a pretty thing to look at. You know, when I started to learn more about that, and I'm the type of person where if I get a little bit of interest in something, I'm probably going to ignore everything else for a month while I just really, you know, obsess over it. And I started getting into it, and like, you know, the numbers are out of control. The numbers are ridiculous. If you think of like the Coney Island boardwalk being made of ipe, and that huge expanse of boardwalk and all of that wood. And then if you like look at an ipe tree and you look, where does it grow? It grows in a rainforest. How dense is ipe in that rainforest? One tree per 2.6 square miles. And then that's one boardwalk using hundreds of thousands of board feet of lumber. And that's one boardwalk. I mean, you can look at all the other boardwalks in the country, and you can start to realize what must have happened to harvest that material. If you look at classic furniture made from rosewood and look at rosewood lumber, you'll have a really hard time finding rosewood solid lumber wider than 6 or 8 inches. Like if you can find it wider than that, somebody's probably been sitting on it for a good long time, because there's no lumber that wide these days, because there's no rosewood trees that big these days. They've been harvested. And what we're getting is skinny new growth. Same thing is true for a variety of species. You know, Gabon ebony is on the brink of extinction. It doesn't grow in like 75% of the countries it used to grow in. It's been harvested to near extinction. That's one thing, and that's enough for me. Like that raises my hackles, and that's like, this is obviously a huge issue. But there's a whole other set of numbers, and those numbers concern what's here already now and what happens to it. And so if you can look at a typical nor'easter season in New York City, thousands of trees are going to get either blown down outright or compromised to where they need to be taken down. The volume of like good quality furniture grade hardwood in that mass of material is huge. But because it's storm damage, it kind of is an emergency to get rid of it. You know, if there's a tree laying across a New York City street on top of 2 cars and power lines, they're not really taking any time to figure out what's the best way to do this. It's like, get that thing out of here. So that stuff gets cut up, it gets mulched, and it gets dumped. It's the most efficient way to process a huge quantity of material. The city pays by the ton to dump this in landfills. City landfills are at or beyond capacity. Many of them have been closed for decades because they're full. So now we're outsourcing landfill space to other states to dump mulched material that's perfectly usable, while we buy material from overseas that's being harvested via questionable means near to the brink of extinction. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. Just trying to use what's there, show that what's there is actually amazing, And that's been a whole other driving factor. Is it's always new. Every time we open up another log, it's like, whoa, check that out. So it's great. I mean, it's beautiful stuff. And it tickles the fancy of like the woodworker in me and like the wood nerd in me. And it's kind of like how I personally feel, right or wrong, that things should be done. You know, it's all right here. It's all going to waste. It could all be used.
How did you sort of connect the dots and like intervene in between that process? Like, what was that like?
We were doing reclaimed material, furniture using only reclaimed. And I got a phone call from a friend who lived in Philadelphia. And she said to me that there had just been a storm. There was a huge tree that blew down in the park right next to her house. And it was massive. Like seeing it on the ground horizontally is when you start to realize, oh, wow, that's amazing. Like when you look at a tree, it's just a tree. But when it's laying down and the trunk is like chest height off the ground, you're like, whoa, that was actually a rad tree. So she called me. She had talked to some of the parks people that were there surveying the tree. And she said to them something along the lines of like, well, can't this be used? Like, couldn't this be given to somebody to use? And in Philly, they're loosey-goosey. They were just like, yeah, if you know somebody that wants it, it's less work for us. So she called me, and immediately I realized two things. One, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to Philadelphia. I want that tree. I want to do something cool with it instead of it getting chopped up. And number two, I have zero means to do that. I don't have a vehicle. I don't know how, in God's name, I would take a tree and turn it into a log and then get that log from Philly to Brooklyn. And I have no idea what to do with it once that even happened. So I ignored number two, and I borrowed a friend's pickup truck and grabbed another buddy with a pickup truck, and we drove to Philly on like a Saturday and rolled up to the park, and that was obviously the trees right there. I mean, it was huge. You know, so we looked at it, and we're like, okay, what do we do? You know, we had zero tools on us at all. We're just two guys in pickup trucks. Long story short, we were around long enough, and the parks department finally did roll in. And they came, I guess their intention was to start working on that tree because a bunch of trucks came right over to where we were. And when they got out of the truck, I approached one of the people who looked like he was in charge. And I said, hey, listen, a friend of mine and I are here. You know, we're furniture makers. I heard about this tree. And he's like, what do you want wood from that tree? And I said, yeah, actually, I'd love as much as we can get from that tree. And he's like, all right, cool. And then he whistles, and he brought a bunch of guys with chainsaws over, and he pointed out a bunch of things. And like in 5 minutes, these guys had turned this massive tree into 4 logs. And he's like, okay, where do you want them? Are those your trucks? Back your trucks over. And they had one of those trucks with the arm, and it just literally, like, they cut the stuff down for us and loaded it in our trucks and said, good luck, guys. Probably thinking we were crazy because they know what it's like to work with these things, and we had no clue. So that's how it started, you know. And then the next problem was, okay, we're in Brooklyn. I got these 4 logs. Now what? I certainly don't have a means to cut them. I can't put a 2,000-pound log on my table saw. And so we started looking into it, and we started with, you know, small, portable chainsaw-style mills that, you know, were accessible for us at the time. We figured it all out, trial and error, and we milled up 4 logs with a chainsaw. And then, like, again, it's just, okay, what do we do now? I read online that this stuff is not usable. It needs to be dry, right? And it's wet. How do we dry it? How do people dry wood? So, you know, every step of the way, we're looking up what the hell we're supposed to be doing and how to do it and then doing it. And it's funny because looking back, for sure, if somebody had said on that day before I left Brooklyn, like, well, here's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to transport 8,000 pounds of material. You're going to have to get it out of the truck yourself. You're going to have to buy all this equipment. You're going to have to sweat it out doing it. You're going to have to build. It's going to be like a year before you have usable products. Like, I would have been like, oh, yeah, no, forget that. That's stupid. Who would ever want to do that? But being stubborn and naive, we kind of just plodded through the whole process until we had material. You know, I found a guy who sells plans online for a small kiln for turning blanks, like something, you know, 8 feet long and 2 by 2, and he can load a bunch of wood in there and use like a halogen lamp for heat and a basement dehumidifier to get rid of the moisture and dry the stuff out. And so I saw that, I was like, cool, man, let me get those plans and I'm going to scale this thing up. And we made a kiln in the alley between the two buildings. The building our shop was in and the next building over. It was 6 feet wide. So I made a 4 foot wide kiln and loaded up all the lumber in there. So there's just enough room to like squeeze by. And, you know, we stuck a meat thermometer through the wall so I could read it and be like, oh, good, we're at 110 degrees. I think that's good. And, you know, at one point our landlord called and he said, hey guys, what's this thing in the alley? And I told him, and he's like, we really can't do that, but it sounds like a good idea. I'll let you know if somebody has a problem with it. So we kind of got away with that. But yeah, learning process the whole way. You know, eventually, obviously, we took this chainsaw sawmill and said, nice knowing you. And we have like machinery now. We have real lumber mill machinery. And we tore down this homebrew kiln and we have like a professional unit that's designed for this. And we've been stepping things up and we get to work with a lot of interesting people that are into this idea. Instead of going around and finding a tree here and there, we're working with like tree services that do mass, you know, removals when needed and cleanups, and they store material. And they'll say like, hey, I've got 100 logs. You want to take a look and see if you can use anything? And so things have been scaling up.
So your sources are sort of like coming to you at this point.
Yeah, our sourcing logs is the easiest part of the gig. I've got more logs than I can shake a stick at right now. We have more material cut and in the drying process than we can use in 10 years. Like if you're a tree service, it behooves you to call me. You know, you're going to pay your men by the hour to cut up a bunch of logs into small chunks and then to throw them through a grinder. And then you're going to pay your men in a giant truck to take them to the dump. And then you're going to pay by the ton to get rid of it. Or you could be like, hey, what's up? Why don't you come take these off my hands? And then it's gone and you don't have to deal with it. And we have to, it costs money and effort for sure to move around this huge quantity of material and then to mill it and then to catalog it and then to dry it and then to transport it. People think, oh, you get wood for free? No, there's blood and sweat involved.
Are you getting, is it all from New York? And like what species are you getting?
Probably like 95% of our material comes from the city and Long Island. And the species that we get are your typical Northeast hardwoods. So we're furniture makers and we really like working in hardwood. So I don't do much with soft woods, like your cedar and pine and hemlock and fir. But the hardwoods are where it's at for us. And what we get a lot of is red oak and white oak, all the maples. We've gotten sugar maple, silver maple, red maple, Norway maple. We get a lot of ash. We get a lot of walnut, cherry. We get a lot of elm. And then we get interesting stuff that's actually not indigenous to the Northeast U.S., but has been planted or is invasive or was brought here. Species like Norway maple or Ailanthus or European elm. So it's enough to keep it interesting. And, you know, in the past, we've worked with other sort of like-minded lumber vendors. There's a tree farm in Costa Rica. They basically replant and harvest guanacoste, and they'll graft saplings into existing root structures. In 25 years, you've got an enormous tree, and the family's been doing that for a long time. So for us, that's the right source. It's not forest sourced. These aren't like standing trees in the middle of some jungle that they bulldoze a path to. It's all right there on one property, and that's what it is. It's guanacoste trees, renewable. And it's a different looking material, so it's something that kind of, you know, complements what we offer and is a good thing for our customers, but it's coming from the right place. So that's the most important thing. And even then, you know, there's a good handful of species that we get, but everything is always different. We've got slabs from 3 different ash logs, actually 4 right now, that all came from the same tree. There's one massive tree that we got like 4 consecutive logs from, and each one has a vastly different character. Like, you know, the one log is perfectly straight and nice straight edges and super clean, and the other log's got some shape to it, and it's got some inclusions where limbs were cut and there's some cool figure around there. And the third log is crotches out. That's where the tree branched out. And so it's got this really nice flare and a lot of figure in there. And the fourth log is the main leader, and it's got a ton of shape on both live edges. So just from one tree, there's a huge difference in the character of those different logs. But then when you get like 4 different walnut logs from 4 different places, like they're not the same. The live edge stuff, where you're going a wide slab, that's the full width of a tree from natural edge to natural edge. All that stuff in the middle it's different with every log. So, you know, it basically just doesn't get old. You know, we've cut up however many hundreds of oak logs, but every time we cut up another oak log, it's like, whoa, this one's awesome, look at it. You know, they always offer something new.
Is that exciting to like creatively think about the different shapes you're getting and see how you can use them in different pieces of furniture?
Oh yeah. You know, it used to be a joke where it was like, the joke was every time we'd cut open a new log, it'd be like, I'm keeping that one. Because we wound up saying it so much and obviously never did. It keeps that fire burning. It's work, it's definitely work, and it occurs to me as work, but it's also something I can't wait to do. Like when I look at the log pile, there's certain logs in that pile where I'm like, I can't wait to open that thing up. Because, you know, chances are it's gonna be something I've never seen before and it's gonna be beautiful.
Is there like a favorite species you have, or like a certain piece that came through that you were just like, that's the...
I like to say I love all my children, but definitely walnut is a species that just, we'll have a hard time making a walnut slab look bad. Like it's just beautiful. And as a maker, we have to appreciate the fact that like all you have to do is get it flat and put some finish on it, and it's gonna look really good. And you can go beyond that, but it's a beautiful material. But it's also super popular, and I kind of sometimes like the oddball slabs that we get. One of those ash logs that I mentioned, the entire log, every slab, it was really pale wood with very straight grain, not much movement going onto the grain, but across the grain, there was tons of very tight flame figure. And I'd never seen it on that scale, like a 43-inch wide tabletop slab, 12 feet long. And like every 2x2-inch square was beautiful because of the figure and the iridescent shine. So I thought those were very special. We're working on some pieces now from a European elm tree. So this is a planted tree. It's not native to the US. It was planted in Prospect Park, thinking around the 1860s. And at the time that tree died and was dropping limbs and becoming an issue, it was cataloged as the biggest tree in Brooklyn. And we worked with the Parks Department and with some other entities to harvest that material. And I was a little skeptical because it was a dead tree. It was demonstrably, hadn't leafed out for 2 years and was dropping just enormous limbs. It was very dangerous. So we knew that it had disease and that it was compromised. And it was incredibly expensive to get it on the ground and get it into logs and get them moved because they were so massive. And it was a big gamble, because as far as I knew, there could be a cavity inside this tree big enough for 10 people. And it turns out that it was dying from the top down, which is a good thing for us because the main trunk was intact. And it was some of the most incredible looking wood I've ever seen. So that was an instance where the gamble we were taking made it extra sweet that it was usable material, but then the fact that it was like a knockout visually, it was just like, this could not get any better. And that stuff has been very interesting to work with. A totally different character than most of our Northeast hardwoods. It was much more porous. The grain was like out of control. No straight lines, challenge. But the finished products are stunning. Really, really happy with that stuff.
What's slab furniture versus like not slab furniture? What makes it?
Just using like a full width live edge piece and incorporating that natural edge and the shape that brings into the piece of furniture, like that's live edge. Like you can have a tabletop that's 10 feet long and 40 inches wide and a perfect rectangle, and that might be made up of anywhere from, 5 to 8 different boards joined together. And usually when that's the case, those boards are very consistent. And so if it's walnut, for example, the typical method is to take your walnut board, cut out any areas that have the really light colored sapwood and just keep the very dark heartwood. Don't use boards that have big knots in them because it'll draw your eye. And go for consistency. So now your 10 by 40 inch rectangle is all very consistent. The difference between that and the live edge stuff is that the live edge slab, that tabletop's gonna be one piece. And it's gonna have tons of contrast between the lighter bits at the edges and the darker bits in the middle, and big knots and bark inclusions or crotch figure and compression. Like, there's gonna be a lot to look at. There's almost zero consistency. So, it's just a flavor thing. Sometimes one works better in a space and sometimes another. And we don't only work in live edge, we just specialize in it. Like, I love the character. I love the character to the point where some things I'll call character, ordinary woodworkers would call defects. But we figure out how to make them work, make sure they're stable and they're not, compromising the integrity of the piece. But visually, I like what they add. This tabletop right here is a giant crack right in the middle of it. And most people would be like, oh, that's too bad, next. But for us, it's like, that's what makes this piece, is this giant crack right in the middle of it. Now, how do we make it work? And then we make it work.
What do you guys want to do in the near future, like the next 5 years?
I've got a good bunch of furniture designs that I want to introduce. Like, up until now, we've been a custom make company where somebody tells me what they want and we make it. And it might not be available like in a store because it's a custom idea. Or if somebody has a need, we'll custom make something to fit that need. But at the same time, I've got a bunch of designs that I really want to make and just see how people like them. We've put out, our own designs in the past and they've been well received, but there's a bunch of new ones that I can't wait to get out. I'm really excited about that. Overall for the company, I think what we're looking forward to is just expanding the model. We've looked at different towns and different cities and even countries, and seen where there is that kind of disconnect between what's available and what people are using, and nobody's connecting those two things. So, we've looked at Costa Rica and Puerto Rico. We've looked at cities on the West Coast and even here on the East Coast. A lot of people don't realize that most urban areas in this country are very well planted. New York City doesn't occur to people outside of New York City as a source for lumber, but it's the third most well-planted city in the country as far as large trees. And there's hundreds of thousands of trees here. I think during Hurricane Sandy, the estimate was in the tens of thousands of trees that were taken down. Tens of thousands in one storm. So there's a lot. It's impressive, how big and how good quality some of these street trees are. And also the ones that are not in good shape are very interesting. Those compromised trees that grew on a sidewalk with pollution and, people walking their dogs on them or whatever, and, butchering the limbs so they stay away from power lines. All those factors make that tree grow in a compromised way, which usually winds up with very interesting wood. Like when a tree grows nice and healthy and just straight up, it's straight-ish edges and long straight grain lines. But when a tree's like gnarly and it's like been through the ringer, that's really interesting looking material. It's a nightmare to cut and dry for us, but it's cool stuff once it's done. There's cities all over the country that have this same issue where, hundreds of thousands of tons of green waste is being carted off to a landfill when there's thousands of makers in that city buying wood that come from other places. So this can work in a lot of places. And there are a lot of other companies these days doing this across the country. So for us, I think the main vision forward is to just expand the reach of what we're doing, and then expand the product line.
So you kind of want to facilitate those connections between guys, there's this huge source and here's all these makers.
Yeah.
This is something you could do. Is that a community you want to build, or is that just
I think the main way forward, honestly, is developing some type of template bureaucracy. so that you could approach a municipality or a city and say, you know, this is how we make it work in New York City. And, you know, nothing against other cities, but if it can work here, it can work for you, okay? But that's what needs to happen, because if you're gonna work with the city and with a parks department and with like that government body, it needs to be a process. Like they need to have the right form to fill out. You know, I learned that early on when there were trees down in a park, and, you know, we would approach people in charge and say, listen, you can spend, you know, a few $1,000s processing that material, or you can spend zero and put it on my trailer. As much as they want to, they can't, because there literally is not a form for that. There isn't a form that says, I authorized this particular tree from this quadrant of Central Park to be put in this place after it was, like, that doesn't exist. And because it doesn't exist, they can't do it. So it's coming up with that. It's coming up with that process and having it in writing and having it be a thing to serve as a model that we can take to other places and say, this is how it can happen. And then coming up with the numbers, like, why should a city go through with this? You know, you have to prove to them, you have to show them that it's in their best interest for a variety of reasons, most of all financially. Like, you'll be saving this much money. You'll be, you know, part of leading by example. Like, do you want to be the city that leads the charge towards a greener way? Or do you want to be the guys stuck, like, wasting taxpayer money on the old paradigm? And there's a lot of those discussions that need to happen. Here in New York City, those discussions went nowhere. And then there was a change in office. And those discussions happened with the new person, and it was thumbs up. It was, well, we have this gigantic tree in Prospect Park. You guys interested in that? So, you know, it depends a lot on people and on enrolling and inspiring and showing what that vision could be and how it can work for everybody. And it brings in a whole new market. You know, like, I can't have an exclusive contract with New York City. That's just not fair. There has to be an open bid. You know, other people need to be aware, so that if City Parks does have a quantity of material, like, it's unfair for them to say, okay, this goes to RECO. They have to say this is available. So there's a bit of paperwork involved, I think, with getting people on the right track in different cities, but that's part of our, like, overreaching plan.
Is it just a natural thing for you to want to see a process be built and lead the way? You care about the earth?
There's definitely a conflict, because on one hand, we've learned a lot of these lessons, like, the extreme hard way. And everything we do is kind of, you know, it's our method that we've arrived at after years of trial and error. And that error is significant. Like, when you go through the cost and expense of moving around thousands of pounds of material and the year or more that it takes to cut stuff up and get it kiln dry and ready to use, only to find out that you didn't do it well and it's a waste and you got to start over, it's a very expensive, hard-fought lesson. And part of me is extremely reluctant to just make people's lives easier that are trying to follow in our footsteps. And, like, here's how you do it right out of the box. Part of me doesn't want to give that away. The other part of me has always believed in the saying that a rising tide floats all boats. You know, I started woodworking in a community shop. It wasn't just my shop. It was a member-based community shop where there were dozens of other people doing the same thing. And I recognized right away that I learned more because I was not just in my garage. I was amongst all these other makers. I learned more in a year than I had in all the years prior. It was a melting pot. And, you know, when one guy got real busy and then another job came in, he would give it to somebody else. Or when I got real busy and then I got another job come in, I could give it to somebody else. And it became this thing where there wasn't competition. It was good for everybody. Like, the more companies that exist doing what RECO does, the better for RECO, I think. The more people there are out there that place value on buying something that comes from a known sustainable source, the better for RECO and all the other companies. So, I'm balancing my whole like giving away the keys to the kingdom as far as like knowledge and secrets, doing this relatively new thing, with trying to spread it and encouraging other companies that are doing it, and not thinking of them as competition, but thinking of them as like partners in this new way.
It's like creating an ecosystem, and it's like keeping it healthy is going to benefit everybody.
Yeah. And, like I said before, with the example of Hurricane Sandy, tens of thousands of trees came down. I got my hands on a whole lot of them for me, but I didn't scratch the surface of what was out there. So there could have been 10 other RECO Brooklyns in New York, and they still wouldn't have scratched the surface. Like, it's an enormous quantity of material. So the material's out there. I'd love to see more companies making use of it. And part of that means that there's a responsibility for me and for these other companies to sort of, by example, educate the general public on why that stuff is valuable. I'm not just putting it out there because there's a lot of other people making cool tables. We're putting it out there with the story and the reason, like the why, and trying to get people engaged in that. Like, why as a consumer should I think that a red oak table made from a tree that stood in Cunningham Park in Queens and was brought down in Hurricane Irene, why does that hold more value than a red oak table with no story at the same price? And I think the public is like into that a lot. People like the fact that it's A, sustainably sourced, but B, locally sourced. This is a tree that grew here and then fell and then was harvested by people from here and made here and sold to a person that lives here. It is on us to make sure that that process is out there and known, and that it's talked about in such a way as to provide value for customers.
Thanks so much, man. Thanks for talking with us.
It's my pleasure.
That's all we have for you today. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play so you don't miss a thing. Remember to visit us at woodncompany.com for more great content and goods. That's WOODN company.com. Thanks.